What is going on, everyone? My name is Andy. Welcome back to another FPL video. In this one, I've got some of my top tips for FPL success for the upcoming season. Some of this you may have seen before, but it's always worth going through a bit of a refresher, especially if you're new to the game as well. So if you enjoy it, make sure to give it a like, hit that subscribe button, and let's get into it. So let's start with some general strategy. Now, my first point would be don't be too reactive and remember the plan. And I think this especially applies during the early stages of the season. You're going to spend a lot of time during pre-season putting together the best FPL squad you can. And then for some reason, you get to game week 1, some of your players don't perform, there's other players that do really well, and that plan just goes out of the window. Hits and transfers are flying absolutely everywhere. It's probably best just to sit back and relax and think about what your original plan was, and do you have enough information to change that? Because we will get information early on, and we should take that into account, but it doesn't mean that all of your players that have blanked in game week 1 are now terrible. The point applies later on in the season as well, but especially in game week 1, 2, 3, etc., I would say. Following on from that, early transfers can be okay. Just be certain about the move you're going to make. One reason that people like to move early on their transfers is because of price changes. Once the game week 1 deadline has happened, players will then start going up in price if they do well and going down in price if they don't. And by making an early transfer, you can avoid having to pay more for a player or losing value on a player you own. And I think if you're certain that that is the transfer you're going to make no matter what, then you can make it early on in the week, especially early on in the season when there's no European matches and midweek games and stuff like that. As we get later on in the season, personally, I prefer to wait for more information, especially when there's European matches to get through. But early on, it can be a way to build team value. Ultimately, you have to take into account every transfer individually. Sometimes it'll be worth going, sometimes it'll be worth waiting for more information. But I'd only go early if you know there's no other move that you're even going to consider that week. Don't get too hung up on banking 5 free transfers. It's a big change that FPL have implemented this season, that you can roll up to 5 free transfers. Most of us are never going to do it all season. Most people can't even get to 2 free transfers, let alone 5. And look, it's good to make a squad where you don't need a whole heap of changes straight away, but sometimes short-term moves are going to be worth it. Sometimes there will be key information, like you might own a player that's not getting game time. There might be someone else you weren't expecting to play that is getting a lot of time in a new system, in a more advanced position, and you might want to bring them in. That is still fine. Yes, it's good to have a solid squad where you can roll transfers and maybe use them effectively later on, but you don't have to start in game week 1 and roll for the first 5 game weeks, right? So don't get hung up on that. Hits are fine, but you probably don't need as many as you think. Ultimately, I kind of go by the rule that the hits are either worth it or they're not. I don't buy into this, you've got to take more hits or you've got to take less. You have to weigh up each hit individually and decide whether it's worth it. And I think if there's an injury or something like that, or a player's just not getting minutes, or it's a big captaincy swing and you want to bring someone into captain, that hit might be okay if it's a long-term move. But just think about whether you can delay that transfer. Because a lot of the time we justify hits by saying, well, over the next 6 game weeks, the player I'm bringing in will outscore the one I'm taking out. But that hit's going to cost you 4 points, right? So if you don't have the transfer to do it this week, could you just do it next week instead for free? And then it hasn't cost you any points hits, and they can still outscore them in the long term. So I think hits are fine. But again, I mean, one thing to say is with FPL, it's very difficult to give evergreen advice, even though I'm going to try and do it in this video. It might be that in game week 3, there's a hit that's really worth it for your team, depending on injuries and stuff like that. But for most of you, is what I'm trying to say, you don't need as many as you think. And the player you've picked is probably okay to hold on to just for 1 more week, just to see if they can get you something. And then maybe things have changed the week after, and all of a sudden you don't need to remove 4 points from your overall score. Think medium term. I think 4 to 6 game weeks is probably best in advance. 8 game weeks would be the absolute maximum. You can look further ahead than that, but don't get too hung up on what your move's going to be in 11 game weeks time, because so much will change in the meantime. For the start of the season, I tend to not look too far past 6 game weeks even. With a goalkeeper or something like that, I might think a bit longer term, because I know that's a position I don't want to make a transfer on. But 4 to 6 game weeks is where you should be looking. And also, you should focus on the game weeks that are sooner if that makes sense. So let's say you've got two players, and over the next 6 game weeks they've got pretty even fixtures. The player with the better fixtures sooner is the one to go for, right? Because by the time the player B gets to those good fixtures in 3-4 weeks' time, they might be injured or something like that. I know it sounds obvious, but sometimes people don't pay attention to that. And lastly, judge your decisions, not the outcome. Very easy to say, not so easy to do. But if you pick a player and over 6 weeks they just don't perform how you wanted them to, was that a bad decision, or did you just get a bit unlucky? Ultimately, you are not going to make perfect decisions throughout the whole season. Some of you will. Someone's got to win FPL, right? I get that. But most of us, it's not going to happen. So again, sit back, relax, and think about why you made that decision in the first place. It might be that you chose to pick that player for the wrong reasons, and you can adjust that when you make your next transfer later on. But most of the time, you're always picking good players with good fixtures and just hoping that they do well. And guess what? Sometimes they won't. So I've recorded this next bit like 20 times already, and one of the words when I say it just doesn't sound right. So what I want to talk about is being wary of FPL myths. 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 We're just going to go with that. So the first one is you need to be different to do well. You absolutely don't. Of course, it's great to identify a low-owned player with great upcoming fixtures that no one is talking about, get on ahead of the curve, get those points, plus the price rises and stuff like that. But it's not the only way to do well. This idea that you've got to avoid the template to climb up the ranks is just nonsense, right? If you look at the winner from last year, Jonas, most of his picks were just solid options, right, that scored him lots of points. And of course, he got on some of those players earlier than others because he won FPL, right? And you need that little bit of luck. Of course you do. But I wouldn't say that he went out chasing differentials to become number one. And even when he was close to it towards the end of the season, he kept just making good picks, right? So you just need players that score points. Total points is all that matters. Like if I've got 14 of the same players as another person, and then my 15th player is 80% owned and they score 10 points, and the other person has a 5% owned player and they score 10 points, we're going up the ranks exactly the same, right? We've both got 10 points. Their differential points are not worth more than mine, right? So it's nice to go different, and you should look for differentials. It can be handy, but it's not the only way to do well. Next myth, you need attacking coverage. I hate the idea of attacking coverage. It just doesn't make sense to me. Defensive coverage can be a thing. Like, let's say Kwanzaa is first choice for Liverpool at 4.5 million. Well, I can cover Liverpool's clean sheets for less money than Trent, Robertson, Van Dijk. I might not get as many attacking returns, but I can cover the clean sheet. The idea that you can cover someone's attacking returns, I just don't really get. So again, let's use Liverpool as an example. I heard a discussion recently that said Liverpool got great fixtures. So of course, you look at their team, see if they've got any options. But if you look at that and say, I can't really afford Salah and I don't want Trent, but I've got to go for someone else to cover their points, you don't, right? If none of those 7.5 million attackers are going to get regular minutes, there's probably better ways to spend 7.5 million on a player from a different team. So of course, you want to identify good fixture runs and then see if there's any options from that team. But if there isn't, you don't just buy another player to cover it, right? Leon Bailey is not going to cover the goals that Ollie Watkins scores. Of course, if Villa have got good fixtures, Leon Bailey might be the best 6.5 to look at, but there's other options from other teams. So attacking coverage, I just don't get it. You should avoid the early kickoff. I think it's nonsense. Maybe if a team has just played in Europe on Wednesday and then is playing 12:30 Saturday, it's not necessarily ideal preparation. But if it's a good player with a great fixture, there's no way I'm ignoring that for captaincy unless someone else has got a better fixture. It's safer to start with template picks. I don't get that. Again, the only thing that matters is total points. So if you think, or let's say you've got 7 million to spend on a midfielder, and the one you think is going to get the most points is 90% owned, that's probably the one you should buy. If it's a close decision where you're not sure between two players, then you can play it one way or another, right? You can go for the higher owned pick to reduce your amount of risk, or you can go for the lower owned pick to increase the possibility of going up in ranks, right? So take a bit more risk. But overall, again, total points is all that matters. So if a player is a template pick, but you think it's the best one, that's who you should go for. If you think they're rubbish, go for someone else, right? This idea that's come up over the last few years that you've got to go for the template to start the season, I just think it's rubbish. And you can't win FPL in the first few game weeks, but you can lose it. I mean, again, I don't really get what the point of that phrase is. I've probably said it myself on the channel over the years. But again, you're just trying to pick the best players to score the most points. So if you think there's a few differentials that are going to do well, and they're not just differentials for the sake of it, you've got solid reasoning for picking those players. They're going to play, they're going to get good minutes, they've got good attacking threat, they just happen to be low owned. It's fine to go for them. If you have a bad start, it doesn't mean that you can't recoup some of those points later on. All right, let's quickly talk about chip usage. So with wildcards, you've got one in the first half of the season, and then you get another one for the second half of the season. I won't talk about when to use that second one yet. We might as well wait until it's actually active. With the first wildcard, it's absolutely fine if you want to use it early. It's also fine if you want to plan when to use it. So if you want to use it in game weeks 4 or 6, which are quite popular, you can do that, and obviously you can plan your team accordingly. But it's also fine to go into the season with a solid squad for the first 4 to 6 game weeks and just play it by ear in terms of when you're going to wildcard. You might need it sooner. You might have such a good squad that needs minimal transfers that you're going to save it until later on. One thing to say about using the wildcard early this season is it might be quite handy in terms of building team value. Now that can be said every single year, but this year a lot of player prices have gone up, so team value might be more important, and lots of transfers are made early on in the season. So using it in game weeks 4, which is over an international break, or even game week 6, that could be handy in terms of getting on some of those price rises and getting rid of some of the players that are going to drop in price. It wouldn't be the only reason I would use it, but the team value coupled with making some early moves for fixture swings and stuff like that could be handy. I don't yet know when I'm going to use mine. Game week 6 is probably the earliest, but I'm open to any game week essentially. Triple captain, I will definitely wait for a double game week, even though there's going to be fewer of them this season. I think the only time I would use it other than that is if you've got a player like Haaland or Salah and they've got a great single game week fixture. So Salah or Haaland against Southampton at home, Leicester at home, Fulham at home, games like that, especially when they've got a gap between matches, so no midweek games and stuff like that, you know they're fully fit and firing. You could use it in a single game week. I will definitely wait until a double game week, even though it never goes that well for me. Bench boost, some people are going to potentially use it in game week 1. I don't hate that idea, but personally I think there will be as good a week later on, if not better. And so I'd rather just wait for more info. It might be that the way the double game weeks fall, saving your bench boost to pair it up with a wild card in the second half of the season could be quite handy. So if you want to use it in game week 1 just to get it over with, that's fine. But personally, I would just wait for a bit more info. Ultimately, you just want to use it when you've got a great bench, right? And in the second half of the season, you'll probably have more team value to build that better overall squad. And then free hit, I would definitely wait until the second half of the season. Even though there's going to be fewer double game weeks and blank game weeks, there still will be some. And the free hit is so handy for unknown eventualities, right? So if there is a blank game week and there's players that aren't going to play that you want to keep long term, then you can free hit in that blank to not have to get rid of them, or vice versa, you could free hit in a double to go for that massive score. Either way, there's very little benefit, in my opinion, of using the free hit in the first half of the season. So next up, let's talk about using stats in FPL. And don't panic, it's not something you have to do if you want to keep using the eye test, intuition, whatever it might be. As long as you find it fun, that's how you should play the game. The stats are being used more and more, and it's a big part of my game as well. One thing I like about it is it allows you to quickly analyse different players. Like ultimately, I watch a lot of football, but I'm not going to watch all 90 minutes of 10 games every single weekend. It's just not going to happen. There's not enough time to do that. So stats can quickly show you what's happened in a match and how players have performed. And sometimes people will say those stats don't show you everything. Absolutely, they don't. But it's much easier to get that than it is to watch 900 minutes of football every single weekend. It also removes bias as well. If I'm watching a team and there's a player I don't particularly like, I'm probably more likely to focus on what they're doing badly than what they're doing well. Stats don't care about that. They just give you the information. So I find them really handy. I tend to keep it simple. So I use expected goals, expected assists, and then expected goal involvement, which is basically XG and expected assists combined. And then expected goals conceded to look at a team's defence. There's lots of other stats out there, but they're the primary ones I use. And stuff like expected goals and expected assists are much better indicators of what a player might do moving forward than the actual goals or assists that they've scored, right? So sometimes you might hear me say throughout a season, okay, yes, that player scored 4 goals in 6, but the expected goals aren't great. The fixtures coming up aren't great either. I'm not sure that's going to continue. So that's the stats that I use. Per 90 is a good way to directly compare players and put them on more of a level playing field. But you've got to add context, right? How many minutes they actually play is really important. So is the sample size of data you're looking at. The larger, the better. And also fixtures. You've got to look at what's coming up and what they've just played to. So to give you an example about minutes, Watkins per 90 expected goals is, let me just look here, 0.47 last season on Fantasy Football Hub, and Trossard was 0.45. So you could say their goal threat is quite similar when they play 90 minutes. But Trossard isn't a 90-minute man every single match. Watkins is. So if you're looking for who's going to score the most goals, it's going to be Watkins because he always plays. So per 90 data is good, but you've definitely got to think about how often that player is actually going to play 90 minutes. Sometimes it might be better to go for the player with slightly worse stats that you know is always going to be on the pitch. Don't cherry pick. So if you use expected goals to compare one player, don't pick another arbitrary stat for a different player just to make them better. Always use the same stats to compare everyone. Historical data is useful. Lots of people say to me, we're going into this season without any information. We got tons of information on last season in particular, the season before that. Consistent players that put up good stats are still going to be good this year if they got the right fixtures, unless there's been a massive change in their minutes or the system or their position or something like that. But usually historical data is more useful than people point out. And loads of the stats are on Fantasy Football Hub. As always, there's 50% off at the moment if you want to get signed up. Links in the description below. Just to give you a quick idea of what I use a lot, the Opta stats for Fantasy Football, I always go to per 90 minutes. I've got a custom setup, which basically has stuff like expected goals, expected assists primarily. I just save on that and I can just look up any player I want to. So Bruno Fernandes is another one where his expected goal involvement is only 0.16, which isn't great per 90, and 0.3 expected assists. But when you add context, always plays 90 minutes, plays every single match, and has penalties. So if there was another midfielder with similar stats that doesn't play as much and doesn't have penalties, Fernandes would be the one to go for. Price, obviously dependent and stuff like that. So I find stats useful. You don't have to use it, but if you do, keep it simple, per 90, and don't cherry pick. Let's talk about picking your Game Week 1 squad next. So if you want to reduce the number of transfers and hits that are going to be needed early on, I would pick more known quantities. So what I mean by that is players that we've seen perform really well in the past, that have got good minutes, they're always going to start, good underlying data, and just generally are not going to become issues for you straight away as long as they've got good fixtures coming up. And again, I want to reiterate this. It's your team. You should pick it however you want. If you want to go for punts and differentials, that's absolutely fine. But if you've got a third of your squad filled with punts and it all goes wrong straight away, there's a lot to have to deal with, or you're going to have to activate your wild card maybe sooner than you wanted to. The more solid picks you've got, the less there is to worry about. And also, it may even mean that you can react to players that are doing better than you expected a bit easier. Because if most of your squad are just decent options, you only have got to get rid of one of them to jump on the next bandwagon, because the rest of them are still fine to keep a little bit longer, if that makes sense. Some of this is crossed over from previous stuff I've talked about. So look at the first 4 to 8 game weeks. Focus on the closest fixtures primarily. Trust your picks after the first couple of game weeks. Again, you've probably spent a long time during pre-season thinking about this. It hasn't all gone terribly wrong just because of 1 or 2 bad game weeks. Try and limit the amount of pre-booked transfers. It is okay to do it, but you don't want a transfer plan for game weeks 2, 3, and 4. Something's going to go wrong, right? It's very rare that you can get through the first 2, 3, 4 game weeks doing exactly what you plan to do. Someone will get injured, someone won't start, there'll be a massive bandwagon you just want to jump onto. I would limit the amount of transfers you've got ready to go. Maybe one pre-booked transfer in the first 2 to 4 weeks might be okay, but I probably wouldn't do too many more than that. Make sure you're happy with your captain options and choose ahead of time. So every game week for the first 4 to 5 games, who are you going to captain? Are you going to be happy with that? And I do like choosing ahead of time who I'm going to captain, because it means there's less to think about later on. Unless something major has happened in those game weeks leading up to your game week 4 captaincy, for example, it shouldn't really change your mind on who you're going to go for, right? Just because a player is, scored 2 goals the week before doesn't mean they're going to do it that week. You might still go for that option you previously picked. And this sounds obvious, but pick a squad you're happy with, because it'll be much easier to manage, much easier to deal with those players if they don't do well straight away, just to hold on to them. Often I'll see people say, well, I've got that player because so-and-so said I should get them, or I saw everyone else with them. If you don't want that player, just do not pick them, right? Because if you pick someone you don't really want and they start blanking, you're just going to want rid of them sooner rather than later. And I also think make sure you're happy with players that don't always play. Lots of times people say, well, they can get points off the bench. And that sounds great in theory, but as soon as they don't and they start being subbed more often than actually starting, they're just more hassle to deal with. Like Darwin Nunez, for example. We all love the guy, right? And we think he can do well. But if he's not a consistent starter, it just becomes an issue later on. And a lot of people just can't handle that. They want players that are going to start all the time. And to be honest, that's a pretty good way of playing FPL in the first place. So this one's nice and simple. Just keep going. If you have a bad start in FPL, don't panic too much. There's plenty of game weeks to recoup those points. And most of us have a bad stage at some point during every season. And usually it turns itself around eventually. Like if you look at some of my ranks from last season, I started in game week 1 at like 710k, which is actually pretty good. If you're in the top 1-2 million in game week 1, you've had a pretty good game week because there's so many active players. But by game week 8, I was down to 1.5 million. So at that point, I've got lots of people in the YouTube comments saying, why are they watching me? They're ahead and stuff like that. They're the kind of people that you never hear from again towards the end of the season. You've probably got mates like that as well. Then game week 16, I'm right up into the top 300k, so 278,000. Game week 22, not that much later, 30,000. Game week 34, it all starts to go wrong. I'm down to 75k. But by the end of the season, in game week 38, I'm 44k, so I've clawed some of that overall rank back. I won't go into details about what happened, primarily because I didn't go for Vardio, and the late wildcard and free hit 29 didn't pay off. But ultimately, there were stages where I went quite low down, and then clawed it back, right? So just keep going. People will blow their chips early. So there's almost like an artificial rank increase at the start because you've saved your chips. So you'll get that increase in overall rank hopefully later on when you use them. It's also getting harder to finish high because there's so many more players. There's so much more content out there. People are just becoming better at the game. So don't be too annoyed, I guess, if things aren't going quite as well as you hoped or you don't finish at that overall rank you wanted to. Remember, I put when there, but why you started playing FPL as well, right? It is supposed to be a bit of fun. It is supposed to be to try and win those mini leagues. If you're not top 10k or top 50k, it doesn't matter. You can just come back next season. You don't have, or most of you watching probably don't have a YouTube channel where you've got to face up every single week with the rank you've got. Just forget about it. If it doesn't go well, just come back next season. And obviously subscribe for season-long content to help you along the way. And if you're listening on podcasts, rate 5 stars and leave a review. I'd also recommend taking breaks where you can. FPL is a long game. It launched on the 17th of July this year and runs until the 25th of May next year. That's a long time to be making decisions. Where you can, breaks are probably healthy for you. And ultimately, you can't control what players do, right? You can look at all the stats you want, the eye test, consume content, make a decision, but you can't control when that player passes or when that player shoots. I mean, the player that comes to mind from last year is Ben Chilwell. Some of us went for him early doors when he was playing as a winger. There was one point he threw on goal, and rather than shoot for what looked like a pretty easy chance, he decided to pass, and Chelsea didn't get a goal from it. Like, you've made a pretty good decision there. You've gone for a defender that's getting into positions in and around the box. You can't control if they shoot, and if you've had a bad game week because of what players have done, you might as well just step away from it, right? It's not worth getting worked up about it. I know it's easier said than done, but you can just take a break from it. And I think reducing social media time in general is just probably a good idea, not even related to FPL necessarily. I think there's loads of good on social media. I have to like it, right? It's part of my job being on Twitter, Instagram, on YouTube, etc. But there's also a lot of like bad stuff on that. And I think for FPL in particular, I wouldn't call this bad, by the way, but if you've had a poor game week and you log on to Twitter, you know there's going to be loads of good scores posted. And absolutely, you should be celebrating when you do well, but it may not be what you need at that time. So stepping away can be really handy. You don't need to make those decisions for your next transfers there and then. You can give it a day or two and then come back to it. I think that's just healthy and will probably help people make better decisions in general. Sleep on transfers if you're deviating from your plan. So if you said that I was going to go for player A in game week 3 and you have a bad weekend in game week 2 and all of a sudden you want to go for a different player, just sleep on it, right? You'll probably wake up in the morning wanting to go back to your original plan. And I would make the most of enforced breaks. I mean, this is a bit different for me because I do run a YouTube channel, so having that time off on international breaks is nice. And look, I probably will make a bit of content. I will think about my FPL team, but not as much as when the Premier League is on and it's about to be back on like a few days later. That international break, I won't think about FPL too much in that first week. Second week I will, because we're getting closer to the deadline. I think it's a good time, right? There's obviously international matches to watch, but that's nothing to do with FPL. So it's just a good time to stop thinking about it. And don't get me wrong, right? I want you to subscribe. I want you to watch all my videos. I want to put out as much content as possible. But I do think most people will do better in FPL and have a better time with the game if they think about it a little bit less where they can, right? There's going to be times where you've got lots of decisions to make. There's lots of game weeks midweek and on the weekend, etc. But where possible, the key takeaway, take a break. And lastly, the most important tip of them all, make sure you're following me if you're not already. Most of you will be watching this on YouTube. If you haven't already hit that subscribe button, make sure you do. I've got content planned from now right up until the Game Week 1 deadline, then all throughout the season as well, pretty much daily, apart from when I'm going to take some time off during those enforced breaks and the international breaks. And any video that you enjoy, make sure to hit a like. If you're listening on podcasts, 5-star reviews really help out. So make sure you do that on any platform that you're listening on. And also, I'm on some of the other social media platforms as well. TikTok is Let's Talk _FPL. Twitter is the same, Let's Talk _FPL. And then Instagram is just Let's Talk FPL. The short form content on there, stories on Instagram, tweets on Twitter, etc. Loads of ways you can follow all the nonsense that I'm going to spout for the next season. I don't know why I've used one of the pictures from my thumbnails. I hate doing those poses, but there you are. If you're watching on YouTube, you've seen that. I'm going to leave it there. Any tips that I've missed out, let me know in the comments below. Hit like, hit subscribe, and I'll catch you again tomorrow.